There is one faith which purifies the heart, which gives the victory, which brings access to God, which gives the victory over that which separates from God. George Fox, from his book, Some Principles of the People Called Quakers.
We are reading the Gospel according to Mark. This is session 28. We left off in chapter 15, verse 32. Let's proceed, starting with verse 33 through 41. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Elohi, Elohi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, listen, he is calling for Elijah. And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was God's son. There were also women looking on from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the younger, and of Joses and Salome. These used to follow him and provided for him when he was in Galilee, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. That language that is in verse 34 is actually an Aramaic, a language that was being spoken by most people in Palestine at that time. I believe in Matthew there's a slightly different version where it's in Hebrew. If I remember right, giving him sour wine may also have been like a sedative or something that someone was giving him to help ease more with the pain. Just like if we think of in the older days, people might give someone liquor to soften pain. In verse 38, I look at that and I think perhaps that should be in parentheses, because what's being said there is kind of a comment. Although if you read the other Gospels, there's a difference in understanding of what was happening here. There was an earthquake. There's no earthquake in this version of the crucifixion and death of Jesus. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, which really meant that there was now full access to God. The curtain that's being talked about here is to the Holy of Holies in the temple, which was the holiest spot, and that's where God was understood to dwell, in the Holy of Holies. In saying the curtain was torn, was rent, would be an understanding that no longer is there that separation between God and man, that now there's a real full access for everyone here with the death of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus. One very interesting thing here in verse 39, my translation has, truly this man was God's son, as what the centurion said. Anyone have a different translation than truly this man was God's son?
It's similar. This man really was the Son of God.
Okay. Anyone else have anything even a little bit different?
This man was the Son of God.
This man was the Son of God. Okay, anything else? I just wanted to say, I think in all these three cases, those are all wrong translations. You remember the centurion, a Roman centurion, was not a Jew. He would have been a pagan and believing in all sorts of gods. And if you look at the Greek says here, there's no articles like the or a before these words man, God, or son. And what he's probably saying, this man was a son of a god. He's a pagan, and he's realizing there's something unusual about Jesus here. And he wouldn't be a Jew, so he wouldn't have one God. He'd have many gods. And being a son of a god would indicate that for him as a pagan, there's something unusual about this man. So that's probably the correct translation. This man is a son of a god. He recognized something different about Jesus here in the crucifixion. And that's why it's being said here. But to say the Son of God, that's not what the Greek says. It's what a Christian would say. Even for this pagan, he recognized something unusual about Jesus.
appreciate that translation, Henry. That bothered me for the same reason that he would not have been a Jew.
Right. When I do the other spiritual topics series, which hopefully will begin maybe on the 24th or the 1st of 10th month, these are the kinds of things that really need to be talked about, these translations and how they can be misleading. But even early friends, if they felt there was something wrong with the King James Version, which was a pretty good translation, they would have people that knew Greek and Latin and go check these things out to see if they really were accurate translations. I've read about this in some of these early Quaker documents. They were far ahead of a lot of biblical scholars today, unfortunately, in some of these things. It's unfortunate that if you have someone translate it incorrectly, then everyone else assumes that that's the correct translation without really looking deeper. And the other unusual thing here is in verse 40 and 41, we have Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and of Joses and Salome. These women used to follow him, and there were many other women who had come up with him to Jerusalem. This is pretty unusual, too, to have these women helping him as part of his group of apostles and disciples. Women held a pretty low position in patriarchal Judaism at that time. And to have these kinds of comments is saying something unusual, something different. Any other comments on this section?
I wanted to ask Henry, I think in around verses 33 and 34, it said noon, and they talked about the 6th and 9th hour. And I just wanted to know in that period of history how people expressed the time of day, because I believe when you read the translation, it said noon. And then I know in King James Version 33, 34, it talks about the 6th and 9th hour. How did people refer to time a day in that period?
Okay, it says noon in my English translation, but in the Greek it says it being the 6th hour. The 6th hour would be noon because you started off in the morning. The 3rd hour would be 9 o'clock for us, and 6 a.m. would be the start of daylight. For a Jew, though, of course, the day began the evening before. But here, in terms of talking about this kind of time, it's every 3 hours. So the 3rd hour is 9 o'clock. The 6th hour is 12 o'clock noon. The 9th hour is 3 o'clock in the afternoon, like that. And then at night, you had the cock crows, which was a Roman thing, but I'm assuming it was also the Jews understood it too to be every 3 hours. First cock crow, second, third cock crow.
Thank you, Henry.
Let's read the next section to the end of the chapter. When evening had come, and since it was the day of preparation, that is, the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council, who was also himself waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, went boldly to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Then Pilate wondered if he were already dead. And summoning the centurion, he asked him whether he had been dead for some time. When he learned from the centurion that he was dead, he granted the body to Joseph. Then Joseph bought a linen cloth, and taking down the body, wrapped it in the linen cloth, and laid it in a tomb that had been hewn out of the rock. He then rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joses, saw where the body was laid. Okay, the day of preparation. In Greek, they still use that word for Friday, day of preparation. Saturday is the Sabbath. And this is unusual that Joseph, he was a respected member of the council, that he would go and ask for the body. It seems from what I've read that what they would do is just dump these bodies and let them decay and let the wild animals go at them in some pile. It was really a horrible death and a horrible thing to do afterwards. But here Joseph is asking for the body of Jesus. My translation here in 44 says, then Pilate wondered if he were already dead. The Greek, I understand it to say he was amazed that he was already dead, that Jesus had died so early, so quickly. Oftentimes it takes 2 or 3 days before someone would die on the cross. They most often would die of asphyxiation because of the body leaning over. They couldn't breathe anymore, although all sorts of other possibilities were true too. On 44, then Pilate was amazed he was already dead. And in verse 46, I don't know if you all have seen any pictures of tombs. There actually have been some excavated in Palestine from the 1st century, and they're hewn out of the side of a hill or rock or whatever. and there was this big round stone that they would roll from one side and close the entrance to the tomb. And that's what's being talked about here. If I remember the picture I once saw, it's probably about 4 or 5 feet in diameter. I don't know if any of you have seen anything like that, have been to the Holy Land. I've noticed that, but it's a huge stone. Let's go on to 16, up to verse 8. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of James and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint Jesus. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. In verse 5, we have here a statement that they saw a young man dressed in a white robe. If you recall, in the other Gospels, you have not a young man, but what?
An angel.
Angels, yes. But here it's a young man and dressed in a white robe. If you recall, what does the color white often refer to? What was the meaning, the symbolism of white? Victory. It's the color of victory. We think of white in terms of purity, holiness, but for a Jew at this time, or not even only Jews, but white was the color of victory. If you recall in the book of Revelation, the saints are wearing white robes. They're victorious. They've conquered Satan. They've conquered death. They are now with Jesus. The color white often does have that connotation of victory, being victorious. Just like the color purple, purple togas, purple clothing was the color that royalty, Caesar, his family, and others high up would wear. You couldn't wear purple. If you recall, they mocked Jesus by putting a purple cloth on him, as if he were royalty, king of the Jews.
Henry?
Yeah.
One of the African-American churches, I think it may be the AME, a lot of the members will dress in white on Sundays.
Ah, interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Does they know if they understand the original earlier understanding of the color?
No, I don't.
Okay.
And I've been in some other black churches, and that wasn't the practice. So evidently is kind of a denominational thing.
Uh-huh. I know that Catholic children, when they make their first communion, are dressed all in white. White pants, white dresses, everything is white. Okay, if you go to verse 8, so they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. That's what my translation says. Does anyone have anything different, especially towards the end of that verse?
Mine said the women were confused and shaking with fear, so they left the tomb and ran away. They did not tell anyone about what happened because they were afraid.
Okay.
I may be giving away what you're going to say.
I don't know. I'm going to say a linguistic thing, so I don't think that he's giving it away yet.
My Greek translation is trembling and amazement.
Okay, I have terror and amazement. That's fine, but that's not what I'm pointing to. There's an important point here that in some of the most important, oldest Greek manuscripts we have, this is where this gospel ends. This is the last verse of the gospel. And then we will get into all these things that come later. But the strangest thing about this verse is the last two words in Greek, ephebunta gar, for they were afraid. This word for in Greek essentially only occurs as the second word in a sentence. And here, the way people have translated this, it's like all of 8 is one sentence, when in actuality it probably isn't. We would put a period after, and they said nothing to anyone. The Greek actually says they said nothing to no one in Greek. They were afraid. Ephobunta is they were afraid, and gar after it is for they were afraid. There are a lot of explanations, but the best explanation, and then the one that I clearly see here, number one, because of the linguistic issue here, that it looks like the last part of this gospel got lost before it was ever copied by other people. It was like the last page of the Gospel of Mark. In the first century, they had just begun to make what are kind of like the books we have today with one page after another. They're called codices, a codex. Up until the first century, you still got scrolls, but they were beginning to cut individual pages. And it would appear here that perhaps the very last page of the original gospel got lost, got ripped off, whatever, before it ever got copied by anyone. Because it seems here, if you're looking at it linguistically, these last two words, this is almost in the middle of a sentence. For they were afraid, the blank, 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 and then you don't have an ending. It seems like that was the last word on that page of the manuscript that survived. So what happened then was that early Christians felt that this was incomplete because it says nothing at all about the appearances of Jesus, what happened, his ascension. All that's disappeared because in some of the earliest, the best manuscripts, it ends right there. Now, if you have verses 9 through 20, that's common in a number of manuscripts, but there's also a shorter ending to Mark, which I'm going to read in a second, which is not in the one that has the numbers. It goes this way, it's just two sentences. And all that had been commanded them, they told briefly to those around Peter. And afterward, Jesus himself sent out through them from east to west the sacred and imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. That's how some of these Greek manuscripts end. That's just the end of it. Now, other Greek manuscripts continue, and they have verses 9 through 20, which we're going to go through right now. And it's even more complex than I'm trying to explain. But okay, we'll read 9 through 20. And this is the longer ending of Mark. So we'll read 9 through 11. Now after he rose early on the first day of the week, he appeared first to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons. She went out and told those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping. But when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her, they would not believe it. She's a woman. They wouldn't believe a single woman. You need 2 witnesses, male witnesses, of course, to make it real for the Jews at that time. And even, again, 7 demons. 7 is a number that may mean 7, it may not mean 7. It's used quite a lot in the book of Revelation. We have 7 days of the week. There are various things that occur in 7. So we talked about demons in the past. All right, let's continue. Verse 12 and 13. After this, he appeared in another form to 2 of them, as they were walking into the country, and they went back and told the rest, but they did not believe them. Okay, anyone know what that might be referring to? That's the appearance of Jesus to the 2 on the road to Emmaus, where he appeared to them, and most likely that's what this is. So from verses 9 through 13, we have these repetition, just sort of in a single sentence or 2, of what are mentioned in much greater depth in the other Gospels. The whole meeting of Mary Magdalene in the garden near the tomb, and the whole story about those 2 disciples walking away from Jerusalem to Emmaus. But here we just have a single sentence or 2, kind of like a synopsis of what you have in the other Gospels, because again, they're trying to fill in this missing ending to this Gospel. Okay, then 14 through 18. Later, Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness, because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And he said to them, "Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation. The one who believes and is baptized will be saved, but the one who does not believe will be condemned. And these signs will accompany those who believe. By using my name, they will cast out demons. They will speak in new tongues. They will pick up snakes in their hands. And if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. They will lay their hands on the sick, and they will recover." Okay, well, you have here Jesus appearing to the 11. Do you recall that episode where the apostles locked themselves in a room because they were afraid of being arrested, and Jesus appeared to them in that locked room? And not only that, but he really proved that he wasn't some kind of ghost by actually eating fish.
And
Again,
Thomas was not with them.
yes, right. So you have that episode there. But, also even there are mentions about their stubbornness and their lack of faith that he was upbraiding them for. So this is interesting that you're having just a sort of a 1 or 2 sentence abbreviation of what occur in the other Gospels, because these early Christians felt that something was missing here with this last page or whatever missing from this Gospel, and they just are summarizing what we know from the other Gospels. Or it might have even been just oral tradition. Because if you continue on with the section I just read, by using my name, they will cast out demons, they will speak in new tongues, they will pick up snakes in their hands, and if they drink any deadly thing, it will not hurt them. This might have been an oral tradition, but again, we don't know where that came from. And then finally, in verse 19 and 20, so then the Lord Jesus, after he had spoken to them, was taken up into heaven and sat down at the right hand of God. And they went out and proclaimed the good news everywhere, while the Lord worked with them and confirmed the message by the signs that accompanied it. What I've read, you'll have combinations of these things, or partially. Some of these things might be in one manuscript, others might have the whole thing. It varied depending on manuscript. So that clearly there was something unusual here, and it appears the best explanation, as far as I can see, and others also agree here too, that the last part of this was lost before it ever had a chance to be copied and other copies made from it. So very early Christians felt it's clearly something missing here if it's like in the middle of a sentence that this gospel ends. The linguistic part of me says you just don't end a gospel in the middle of a sentence, for they were afraid. And it's the word for is the last word in some of those manuscripts. Let me also add one more thing here. After verse 14, there is another longer ending that's included within this long ending of Mark. And I'm going to read that one too. Probably not in all of your translations, because this isn't a footnote of mine. But here it says, other ancient authorities add in whole or in part, and then I'll read it. And they, the disciples, excused themselves, saying, this age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now. Thus they spoke to Christ. And Christ replied to them, the term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven. I think that's pretty powerful too, even though it's not in your usual gospel ending here. It's clearly something from very early Christianity. So I don't know if what I've been saying here about the ending is surprising to some of you. There's been a lot of discussion, I gather, over generations about why there are so many different endings to this gospel, and that why even some of the very best, just end with verse 8, somewhat like in the middle of a sentence. And it seems to me the best explanation, as people have said, is that the last section was lost. The last page or whatever was lost.
Well, I see the parenthetical statement at the end of the shorter version and beginning of verse 9 both start with the word and, which seems to indicate that they think that, or they were afraid, is kind of a, dangling participle or something.
Yeah. And let me explain something further here. This word for they were afraid, this is a conjunction for, F-O-R, for they went to Jerusalem, for he had a son in Jerusalem, for he had a big dinner last night. It's that kind of for. In English, that for always is the first word in a sentence. In Greek, it's always made the second word in a sentence. So you'd say, they for went to Jerusalem. That's how you'd say it in Greek. In English, we would do it like the Greek would do it. And to have it be the last word in a work is very weird. Like I said, there's probably a period, if we were to put in punctuation, before these last two words, for they were afraid. I think it's the best explanation of why you have so many variations depending on the Greek manuscript. Let me just read something. This is a book on a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament. It's a little companion volume to the Greek New Testament, and it just tries to explain some of the variations in the manuscripts. This particular variation, there are about 6 or 7 pages to explain it rather than just 4 or 5 lines. I'll just read a couple of things here. 4 endings of the Gospel, according to Mark, are current in the manuscripts. The last 12 verses of the commonly received text of Mark are absent from the 2 oldest Greek manuscripts, absent from the Old Latin Codex Bobiensis, the Sinaitic Syriac manuscript, absent from about 100 Armenian manuscripts, and the 2 oldest Georgian manuscripts, written 897 AD and 913. And then these early Christians, Clement of Alexandria and Origen, show no knowledge of the existence of these verses. Furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome, Latin Christians, attest that the passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. The original form of the Eusebian sections drawn up by Ammonius makes no provision for numbering sections of the text after chapter 16, verse 8. Not a few manuscripts which contain the passage have scribal notes stating that the older Greek copies lack it, and in other witnesses, the passage is marked with asterisks or oboli, the conventional signs used by copyists to indicate a spurious addition to a document, so that these additional verses after verse 8, the copyist would put an asterisk or an oboli to indicate that they're not sure if this really belongs in the original. I could read on for another 3 or 4 pages here. It's kind of interesting, too, what they say. There are a number of words in these variations at the end that don't occur in the rest of the gospel, like they were written by someone else. Anyway, that's an interesting ending to the gospel according to Mark.
Henry, the 2 versions that you read that are not the most common included, are those footnoted in what New Revised Standard Version?
Yeah, they're noted in my particular New Revised Standard Version, probably also in the Revised Standard Version. Some translations put them in footnotes, some don't. I kind of like that last one that I read. I actually will just read it again because it clearly is a very powerful statement here. The apostles, they're trying to make excuses for being afraid and all that, and they try to explain to Jesus why they were the way they were. The devil, was involved, Satan was involved. So I'll just read that again. Or I'll read the section before it and then go on to it. Later, he appeared to the 11 themselves as they were sitting at the table, and he upbraided them for their lack of faith and stubbornness because they had not believed those who saw him after he had risen. And they excused themselves, saying, "This age of lawlessness and unbelief is under Satan, who does not allow the truth and power of God to prevail over the unclean things of the spirits. Therefore, reveal your righteousness now." Thus they spoke to Christ, and Christ replied to them, "The term of years of Satan's power has been fulfilled, but other terrible things draw near. And for those who have sinned, I was handed over to death, that they may return to the truth and sin no more, that they may inherit the spiritual and imperishable glory of righteousness that is in heaven." There was a comment I wanted to make. Yes, 16, verse 7. "But go tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee." What's strange about that verse? Go tell his disciples and Peter. Well, if you recall, John Mark was the probable author of this gospel. And John Mark is understood to have been the translator or interpreter for Peter when Peter went on his missionary trips. And if you recall, Peter had renounced Jesus in the courtyard. Judas had betrayed him. Peter had renounced him. And if this account written by John Mark is the account he got from hearing and understanding what Peter had said, Peter here is separating himself from the other disciples because he no longer sees himself as a disciple because he had renounced Jesus. So where it says, go tell his disciples and Peter. So those 10 disciples and Peter, because Peter could not see himself being said to be a disciple at this time after he had renounced Jesus. How could he do that? So that's just a very interesting little thing that would get missed by a lot of people, I think.
That's so interesting. I wondered about that too, why he was separated.
But it makes sense knowing that this gospel goes back to Peter and his giving this information to his translator, John Mark. He had to be honest. Peter did, obviously. Well, okay. Any other comments on today's session or in the past sessions?
Is Mark considered older than, say, Matthew and Luke?
Yes, from what I understand from all the more modern kind of biblical scholarship in the last couple of 100 years, they believe that the gospel according to Mark is the oldest one that was written, and that the gospels according to Matthew and Luke actually used it in creating their gospels, so that you find a lot of Mark as part of the gospels according to Matthew and according to Luke. They also used other materials. There's something called Q, the letter Q, which stands for a German word, Quelle, which means source. And the scholars think that there was either an unwritten or a written work that the Gospels according to Matthew and Luke used in addition to Mark in putting together their specific Gospels when they were writing them. Then Matthew and also Luke used their own stuff as well. But Mark clearly is the shortest of them all, but it clearly is seen to be at the basis of both Matthew and Luke. The Gospel according to John is something completely different, has no relationship. It didn't use these three Gospels whatsoever in the creation of the Gospel according to John.
It seems plausible, given the abrupt ending of what they read, that wasn't the end, that there's a missing page or two. And we might think that if the writers of Luke and Matthew used Mark, that maybe those missing pages were there when they used it. And so their endings might have been what was in the original Mark manuscript.
Yes, that's a real possibility. Also, people have talked about that there were perhaps stories about passion, crucifixion, death, and resurrection that were just a separate story, oral or whatever, in various versions that were used by all of them. So it's possible what Jack is saying, and also they might have just did something similar that you'd find that kind of information there. Because again, you only find the story about Emmaus in one gospel, Luke. Of course, in John, it's very different too. Well, you have the story about Mary Magdalene in the garden, in Jesus appearing to her individually. And then, of course, you have other things too, like in one of Paul's epistles, he mentions the appearance of Jesus to James, the brother of Jesus. I don't believe that's mentioned in any of the Gospels. All the epistles of Paul were written before any of these Gospels. So that's even an older account. And I'm also thinking, too, there's a quotation of Jesus in Acts, I believe in Acts 18, is it? That doesn't occur anywhere in the four Gospels. Maybe people aren't aware of this. In early Christian writings, you have quotations of Jesus that are found in early writings that do not occur in any of the Gospels. That, they were preserved maybe orally and then were used in the writings of various Christians that still survive. There's a very small book of some of these quotations. They're interesting. Also, there are apocryphal works that probably are not true sayings of Jesus that were made up as well. So you have to be careful and know what you're reading there. But they usually will say that as such.
Is there any possibility that Q might have been one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that didn't survive the centuries?
I would doubt that. I don't think there's anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls that has such a close relationship to the Gospels as such, because those were Jewish documents, not Christian documents.
Henry, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Some of the books were canonized, and some of them that were uncanonized wasn't put into the scriptures.
Yes.
Is it a possibility that the way Mark ended abruptly was because they decided not to put that portion in?
No, I doubt that seriously. There were many so-called gospels written in those first couple of centuries. I don't even know the exact number, 25, 50 of them that we have the names of. Some of them are very wild in speculation or whatever. We call these four gospels the four canonical gospels. This word canonical goes back to a Greek word canon, C-A-N-O-N. The Greek word kanon, as you pronounce it, kanon means a reed. And a reed was used like a yardstick to measure things. And these four gospels were those that were most often used in these early Christian house churches, if they had any physical books whatsoever, or scrolls. And so these were considered canonical. They were measured in terms that seemed to be, we use a yardstick to measure whether they're right or wrong. You know, is it exactly 36 inches or whatever, you know, a meter, something like that. So that's why they're called canonical, because these seem to be the ones that were really true gospels. All the others were not, except I should mention one gospel, and that is the gospel according to the Hebrews. This gospel, according to the Hebrews, was a very long gospel like Matthew, and it was quoted by a number of early Christian writers, important Christian writers. And so we have quotations from it that are similar but different than the other synoptic gospels, the Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It existed for maybe 1,000 years before copies got lost. It never became part of the canon as we know it, but the canon as we know it really wasn't finalized until the 4th century in some real ways, because different parts of Christianity used various books, and some agreed to use some and not others. And even the Catholic Church didn't finalize what books they felt were canonical until the 16th century, believe it or not. But they used so many right up to that without making them as such the canon. Even the Jews themselves, when we talk about the Old Testament, it wasn't until about the last 10 years of the 1st century that they said these are the books that we consider to be our Hebrew Bible, what we call the Old Testament. So there was variation. There were other books, not just Gospels, but other writings and epistles of Clement and Epistle of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, a number of works that were considered to be canonical among various early Christian churches. Just a few, but most of them were not considered canonical.
And the Catholic Church has the in between the Old and the New Testament with the Maccabean Wars.
Oh, all those other, the apocryphal works, which were in the King James Version when it was first printed, and were there right up until the 19th century. And in the 19th century, the Protestant churches started taking out those apocryphal works you'd find in the original King James Version, as it was originally printed in the 1611, 17th century. I'm not exactly sure why the Church of England took those books out, since they were there for some 200-300 years. But Luther, Martin Luther, didn't like the Epistle of James. He took it out of his Bible. Later, Lutherans put it back in.
Kind of refuted something he held important, which is that it was faith and not anything we do that matters.
Yes, that was important. So the Epistle of James, the letter of James, did not seem to quite agree with that. So he just decided to take it out of his Bible in German. But later, Lutherans put it back in. Anyway, we're finished. I think what we will start next week is to read the epistles of John and Epistle 2 and 3. Then maybe go on to Luke. But right now, I think we'll go there first. So next week, we will start with 1 John, okay? Okay, Nancy, I can shut that off. Thanks.
This podcast has been a production of Ohio Yearly Meeting. It was hosted by Henry Jason and edited by Kim Palmer. The introduction and credits were read by Chip Thomas. The quote in our introduction is from George Fox's book, the full title of which is Some Principles of the Elect People of God Who Are in Scorn Called Quakers. A link to that work is included in the show notes to this episode. We welcome feedback on this or any of our podcast episodes. Contact us through our website, ohioyearlymeeting.org, or email us at oimconservative@gmail.com.